I watched a fascinating docu-series last year on Netflix. It's called Connected, and it highlights the way that seemingly small aspects of the natural world make a significant impact on the larger environment. For instance, on how a tiny particle of dust somewhere half a world away actually has bearing on the oxygen that you and I breathe, and how birds thousands of miles away actually have bearing on things like the weather that you and I experience every day. It's truly fascinating to think about the way that creation is so interconnected, how we are indeed dependent on every created aspect of the world in which we live. Again, the series is called Connected. Well, I got to thinking about that series again this week as I began to read and to reflect on today's gospel lesson from John chapter 12 that we just heard Robert read. Here in this passage, Jesus announces to his disciples that the hour of his death is soon coming, and he uses a metaphor to explain the significance of what is about to take place. He says, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Now, the disciples, of course, had no idea what Jesus' words meant here. For the disciples were still reluctant to believe that Jesus would even die. Thus, they certainly had no conception of him dying and then rising from the dead. Thus, in this moment, the disciples no doubt thought that here was yet another of Jesus' enigmatic teachings, yet another colorful parable that they weren't quite sure what to do with. But we, all these years later, have a very clear understanding of what Jesus was saying. The point of the metaphor, we know, is that Jesus is the grain of wheat, and that it is only through his death and through the subsequent act of pulling our broken humanity through death with him that we, like him, can be resurrected in a world in which the spell of sin has been broken. Jesus, lest he dies, is the single grain of wheat. Yet through his death, a harvest of resurrected humanity is made possible. That, we know, is the point of the metaphor. But then Jesus adds to it this. Yes, those who love their life will lose it, and those who give of their lives will keep it. Here's what I want to draw our attention to this morning. Beyond the primary meaning of the metaphor in this passage, there is a secondary meaning to it, no less significant or consequential than the first, and that is this: that paradoxically, it is when we surrender our desire for power and glory and status that we end up living a life of true significance and meaning and consequence. And that conversely, when we pursue our own glory and power and might, our effect on the world is actually less consequential in the end than it otherwise could have been. A fascinating paradox. Consider quickly a very easy and obvious example of this at work. In Frank Capra's It's a Wonderful Life, the character who seems to have all the power and glory and status is Mr. Potter, the wealthy businessman who controls virtually all of the affairs of Bedford Falls. He's rich, he wields power, people all fear him. The world is, it would seem, his oyster. Meanwhile, the simple, others-focused George Bailey, the man who runs the small, modest savings and loan and who has given his life for his family, The man who strives to make life just a little bit better for everyone else in the town. Well, the whole film is framed in a way that we see at first how inconsequential such a life seems to be, particularly for the one living it. But then, of course, comes the big reveal. And in the big reveal, George Bailey is given insight into how different the world would have been had he never lived. And the picture that we as viewers see is not only a grim picture, but a deeply sad one too. Because George Bailey's mark on the world had made the world such a demonstrably better place. Now, I don't know about y'all, but every Christmas season when I watch this movie and when I see all of Bedford Falls show up one by one, coming forward to put money down to bail George Bailey out of his situation, all of them saying things like anything for George Bailey, all these people whom he'd stood by and championed and supported his whole life, never expecting or dreaming of anything in return. I don't know about y'all, but every time I watch that, I get teary-eyed. Every single time. And I do so, I think, not only because I'm a sucker for a good tug at the heartstrings, which I am, but also, and more importantly, because it awakens in me a recognition of a deeper law of nature. A law established by Creator God and a law spelled out and embodied by Christ Jesus Himself. And that is that to live for oneself is ultimately to lose oneself. While to give of oneself is to find one's place in the story that God is telling with all of creation. Now, it's easy to nod our heads at this and to feel a sort of warmth when we think of the George Baileys of the world. When we get to imagine such a life as set to background music, and when we get to imagine George Bailey as looking like Jimmy Stewart and coming home every night to Donna Reed. But the simple truth is that today we actively encourage lives that are aimed toward being more like Mr. Potter than like George Bailey. We do, both tacitly and even overtly. It is a remarkable thing that has taken place in the last quarter century or so. Don't get me wrong, we've always quietly aimed our lives as human beings at being more Potter-like than Bailey-like, always been more drawn in that direction. That is, at seeking after power and glory and might for ourselves rather than at living a life of sacrifice and simplicity and service for others. That's just basic human sin as old as the Garden of Eden. But up until recently, we at least recognized this propensity within human nature. And we at least pretended like we thought that the George Bailey life was a more meaningful way to live than the Mr. Potter life. We taught people not to brag, not to show off, not to vaunt themselves. We taught people to consider others first. Taught people not to be fooled by things that shimmer and shine, but not so much anymore. Not so much anymore. Today we encourage people to boast about their self-importance. We reward them for it, admire them for it. We teach people to derive their sense of self-worth by the number of people who admire them. We encourage people to try to attain as many flashy and expensive things as possible. And then, what's more, to make sure and advertise having these things so that others will see it and envy. We laud the people who boast about their power and their success. And then we quietly consider the ones who talk about sacrifice and virtue as being somehow weak or pitiable. We do. We all know we do. I know I've been on something of a soapbox lately about the hyper-preoccupation we have these days with attention and notoriety, but I do so because it's a problem of gargantuan proportions. And it doesn't seem like we truly as a society appreciate the potential ramifications. What I mean by this is that if we raise up an entire generation of people whose primary sources of entertainment form them to think that a worthy life is a life with the most followers and subscribers, and if we raise up an entire generation whose only exposure to public leadership has been leaders who tout their greatness and who are commended for being recalcitrant and abrasive rather than reasonable and even-handed, and if we raise up an entire generation whose vision of a meaningful life is driven by algorithms that point them toward flashy product after flashy product, rather than by communal networks that teach them to serve and to give of themselves, well, if so, then we are going to have a dystopian nightmare on our hands. And I recognize that that might sound hyperbolic, but just go with me here. For if indeed these words from Jesus are true, if indeed this maxim that he speaks in John chapter 12 is a deeper law of created reality, if indeed to give of one's life is to become more fully human, but to hoard one's life is to lose something central to our humanity, well then, if so, then the current trend towards self-congratulation and self-preoccupation and will to power will invariably result in a society that is increasingly something less than truly human. Invariably. Yes, unless a wheat of grain falls into the ground, Jesus says, it remains just a single self-serving grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Dear family, if we don't get a check on the vision we are collectively casting for a good life, if we don't soon recall our better angels and begin putting forward entertainment and products and leaders that celebrate giving rather than taking, sacrifice rather than conquest, integrity rather than power, well, if not, we are going to be a society of single grains. And as the metaphor suggests, a single grain, no matter how rich or powerful or beautiful, no matter how much property or how many houses or how many followers, regardless, a single grain is just a single grain. Its net effect on the growing good of the world, zero. Zero. Perhaps the most powerful final sentence in all of English literature is that from George Eliot's Middlemarch, where Eliot, writing of Dorothea Brooke, a quiet, simple woman who lived a quiet, simple life, Eliot writes, and I quote, "The growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and who rest in unvisited tombs." In other words, the reason that our lives so often are what they are, the reason for so much of that which is noble and excellent and praiseworthy and true in our lives is in large part due to the countless single grains who of their own willingness and accord fell quietly into the earth for others. Due, that is, to the quiet interconnectedness of things at this deeper level of created nature, at this level typified by the George Baileys of the world, not by the Mr. Potters. For we simply don't know why certain things are for us the gracious way that they are. How many of us, for instance, have any way of knowing whose hands place these gorgeous stained glass windows? How many of us know whose hands held and shaped and placed these exquisite works of art that we take for granted every Sunday? How many of us still know the names of the countless Boulevard members who, over half a century ago now, gave money they didn't really have to give just to ensure that we had this very sanctuary in which to worship today? How many of us still remember all those names? How many of us know the names of the countless farmers around the world who harvested the grain for the Becky bread that we get blessed with at Boulevard each Sunday? Or, to the very heart of the metaphor, how many of us know where the grain of wheat fell that produced the harvest that made possible the very bread that we will eat today? So yes, the primary meaning of the metaphor in John chapter 12 is about the salvific nature of Jesus' death and resurrection. Let us never overlook that, and let us never cease to wonder at it and to give God praise for it. But let us also realize that there is this secondary meaning to the metaphor, and that this secondary meaning is no less significant than the first. Because this secondary meaning reminds us that there is a deeper law to created nature than the law of self-centeredness that we, in our brokenness, tend to most naturally live by. And that law is this: that to give of oneself is to become increasingly more fully human, and that to live for oneself is to become increasingly more inhumane. Every time. In the beginning, God created humankind out of the dust and tasked humankind with being this world's caretakers. And to do that, we must be truly human. And the only way to be truly human is to be quietly connected with and daily willing to give of ourselves for other humans. Yes, as that docu-series Connected teaches, a tiny particle of dust in one place has enormous bearing on entire societies far, far away. In fact, the growing good of the world is entirely dependent on that dust. Let those with ears to hear, hear. And all God's people said, amen.